Good evening, and welcome to our last Ask the Experts 2020 election edition livestream before tomorrow's election. I'm Samantha Pelham, a media relations specialist here at Ohio University who works extensively with our faculty members promoting their expertise in research to the media and on platforms such as this. So tonight I am virtually sitting down with three of our experts, Daniel Karney, Roberto Duncan, and Glenn Dutcher, all economics professors in the College of Arts and Sciences. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time out tonight to talk to me and answer these questions on how the candidates' proposed economic policies affect contribution to economic growth, energy, and environment issues, and how workers will be impacted. I think it's going to be a really great conversation, especially the night before the election. I know this is one area I'm personally very interested to learn more about, and I hope our viewers is as well. So before we go ahead and get this conversation started, we'd love to learn a little bit more about each of you, your backgrounds, your areas of expertise. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that'd be great. Glenn, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Samantha. Sure. So I'm Glenn Dutcher, and as you said, I'm in the economics department. And most of my research is within the realm of behavioral economics. And really what I try and understand is how individual workers within a firm respond to various kinds of incentives. So obviously, whenever I'm trying to think about these kinds of issues, it extends sort of beyond what we call personnel economics. So it extends beyond that, and it extends into fields of labor economics, the bigger issue, which of course deals with all kinds of fun stuff: unemployment rates, labor unions, wages, is minimum wages, do we want to set a minimum wage or not? All those kinds of fun things.
Great, thank you. Roberto, How about you?
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I'm Associate Professor of Economics, specializing in international finance, macroeconomics, and development economics. I have taught intermediate and advanced courses of macroeconomics and econometrics here at OU. In particular, my research has focused more on topics such as macroeconomic volatility, the cyclicality of macroeconomic policies, both fiscal and monetary policies, the so-called global imbalances, the U.S. trade deficit, inflation dynamics, and more recently, inflation forecasting across advanced and developing economies. I came to OU 10 years ago, and I'm originally from Peru.
Great, thank you. And Daniel, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Daniel Karney. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Economics. I study energy and environmental policy and how those two things interact with each other. So how regulations that help improve environmental quality impact the energy markets, and how policies in the energy markets and factors and influences and occurrences in energy markets influence the environment. And I've been here since 2014. I teach microeconomics.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves, having this idea of, what your area of expertise is and what you can talk on. I think will be really beneficial for our viewers if they want to ask a little more specific questions, as well as, more general ones. So now a reminder to our viewers that if you have a question that you'd like to ask all of these experts or one of them, please feel free to message one of the Ohio University social media accounts or comment on the live stream. We will do our best to get to all of your questions tonight, but if any go unanswered, we will be sure to get those questions to these experts, get them answered, and then get them back to you. So, comment away and ask questions. That's what we're here for, is to answer them. So without further ado, let's get this conversation started. Glenn, I'll go ahead and ask you the first question. Can you talk a little bit about what the political leanings of most economists are, and how politics and economy go together?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. I think what's really interesting about economists is I think that a lot of people have a predetermined notion of sort of which direction we're automatically going to lean. But I think if you step back a little bit and you sort of think, well, economists are humans too, right? We probably have differing opinions also on various issues. Then you realize, economists are sort of all over the spectrum too. And so even within economics, we have sort of subfields of economics, which you would classify as very, very, very left wing or very, very right wing. And so I think on average, economists are sort of all over the place. And I think that for the most part, at least for me, and I know that Professor Karney and Duncan do the same. Whenever we're teaching, we also are teaching in this sort of non-partisan manner. And I used to do this more often than I do now, but I would just check, I would ask my students a bonus question on an exam. Okay, we're at the end of class. Your bonus question for this exam is, what political party do you think I'm a part of? And, almost always I would get roughly half of the people would say Democrat and half of the people would say Republican. I thought, okay, good. I'm sort of checking the box then. It's sort of what I'm going for there, is to try and appear nonpartisan in sort of how I present the material to students. And I think in general, that's what economists do, and that's what economists are good at, is not necessarily saying that this is the right policy or this is the right policy, but rather saying, well, here's a benefit of this policy and here's a cost of this policy. What is your policy objective? Well, we can't tell you what the policy objective necessarily would be, but we're usually pretty good at trying to figure out at least what those different costs and benefits are of any given policy, and then it's up to the policymaker to decide, okay, if I know what the costs and benefits are, then I'm going to go ahead and try and do that. And I think that's a lot of what we're really trying to do, is trying to understand or trying to uncover what are all of those little costs and benefits that sort of would result from any one of these different kinds of policies.
Great. Thanks for giving, that first note for people to kind of keep in the back of their heads as we're having this conversation tonight. Roberto, Daniel, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. As I tell my students the first day of economics class, economics is one perspective with which to analyze policy. So in macroeconomics, we talk about all kinds of policies: minimum wage, rent control, taxation. And I say economics is one perspective that can help policymakers evaluate costs and benefits or trade-offs, like Professor Dutcher said. But also, economics is known as a positive analysis. So positive not in good or bad, but positive in like an if-when or if-then analysis rather than normative. So as an economist, I hesitate to ever say should. Right? The word should is not really in my vocabulary as an economist. So that's not what I say. I say we're a tool that we can use, and if you choose this path, then here are the costs and benefits. If you choose this path, then here are the costs and benefits.
Great, thank you. And Roberto, anything to add to either one of those?
No, not much. Frankly, I agree with both Dan and Glenn. In general, I think that's right. I think probably the best way to keep an objective analysis is to base our analysis on economic theory on the one hand and empirical evidence. I think that's something that is changing over time, and of course we have different views even from a theoretical perspective, and that is probably more frequent in macroeconomics, by the way, which is my area. But I think it's across all subfields within economics. But yes, I think that what I try to do at least is to base my analysis on economic theory and empirical evidence as much as possible, and that's the best way to be objective and at the same time, well, it can be appreciated by some part of the spectrum and others not, and vice versa. But that's not the idea. So that's something that will always happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. Usually we have Republicans and Democrats, both of them at the same time, mad at us. That's usually about right.
Yes, usually I said if as an economist, if I'm
-9%. So we look at the worst quarter, the worst period during the Great Recession. That was 2009, the second quarter of 2009. The falling GDP was 2.2. So we are comparing 9% against 2.2. So that's more than 4 times the fall we observed in the worst period of the Great Recession. Fortunately, there was a rebound in GDP in the third quarter, 7.4. But overall, professional forecasters predict that the growth rate will be around -4% for the whole year. So, and they expect that the economy will return to pre-pandemic GDP levels around 2022. So that's the overall panorama. Now, if we look more deeply, we remember that GDP is the sum of these four components. So GDP is like the product, GDP is production, the supply side. We look at the demand side, but we have four components that constitute that side. That's consumption, private investment, government expenditures, which includes public investment, and net exports. Net exports usually are a small fraction of GDP. The most important fractions are consumption, around 68%, investment, and government expenditures around 18% both. So we look at those components. Consumption fell around 10% in the second quarter of this year. If we look back to the Great Recession, the worst quarter again, that was close to 1%. So it was about 10 times worse. So that illustrates how deep is this recession, how severe is the recession. Now, in terms of investment, there's no big differences. The investment also fell more during this recession compared to the 2008-2009 recession. But what I like to highlight here is the behavior of government expenditures and public investment. So the first quarter, it grew just 0.3, the second quarter just 0.6, and the third quarter it fell 1.1. So that's something that we don't like to see during a recession. So what happened during the Great Recession when the stimulus package was implemented? We observed growth of government expenditures between 0.2 and 1.4. So always positive. But the last quarter, at least, that was the information I got. we can wait for any update in the near future. As I said before, it was a falling 1%. So we have a contractionary fiscal policy in terms of growing expenditures and public investment. So I think that's not positive for the economy. All this is related to an unemployment rate that reached a number around 15% in May. Again, higher than the 10% that we observed in 2009, or the 11% that we observed in the Volcker recession in the third quarter of 1982. So again, these are very large numbers that we have not seen before. All these indicators suggest that we are, again, in a deep recession, more severe even than the Great Recession. And on the other hand, this is a peculiar recession. We have to understand that this recession, well, every recession has its own features, its own characteristics, its own causes. This is a recession that was caused by a health shock, a pandemic. It is not like the Great Recession that was caused by a financial shock or the 70s in which we observe an oil shock. This time is different. Also, this is a global crisis, and that's another more important difference. The Great Recession was also a global recession, but this recession is even more globalized. Mm-hmm. For example, forecasts in Europe for this year are negative 10%. Southeast Asia, negative 3%. South America, negative 8%. This is important because exports, U.S. exports, sometimes during some recessions can grow if the rest of the world is growing. That happened a little bit during the Great Recession because we have emerging market economies growing. In spite the US was in a recession and Europe was also in a recession. That's not the case during this year. Probably the only exception is China that is expected to grow at 2%, which is very low for Chinese standards, by the way. Another peculiarity of the recession is, as I said before, consumption fell more than GDP. That's not common. Usually we observe consumption smoothing, what we call consumption smoothing. So income falls, and consumption also falls, but not as much as income. That's not the case so far during this recession. We will have to see what happens during the fourth quarter. That's bad for society's welfare, actually. That's really bad. Another peculiarity of this recession is that it has affected high contact intensive industries. So I'm talking about restaurants, right? I'm talking about hotels, airlines, and so on and so forth. It is important because this group constitutes about 35% of total U.S. employment and 27% of total labor income. And another characteristic of this recession is that I have, at least from my point of view, I have not seen strong countercyclical, and by countercyclical I mean stabilizing fiscal policy. It is true that transfers increased, the stimulus paycheck, which was good, the one that was implemented a few weeks ago. But as I said before, government expenditure and public investment fell. So that's not really fully stabilizing fiscal policy. And the last thing about this recession I would like to highlight is this is probably we're going to see short-run and also long-run effects. I'm worried about human capital accumulation. So by human capital, I mean this stock of intangible assets related to human creativity, education, health, right? All that we need in our workforce to have high productivity and long-run growth. I'd like to finish with some good news. They are not big ones, but at least some positive things that I have seen so far among the macroeconomic indicators. We have low inflation. That's good. The inflation is around 0.51% below the Fed's target, which is 2% per year. There's a rebound of GDP and consumption, as I said before, in the third quarter. We have low interest rates, and the Fed has committed to have low interest rate for the next few years through its forward guidance policy. This is good for consumers, this is good for investors, and this is also good for public debt, because we need to use fiscal deficits during these times. That's part of this counter-cyclical policies, as I was mentioning before. On the one hand, the public debt is large, it's very large. It's more than 100% of GDP, and it has increased to more than 136% of GDP. But on the other hand, the interest payment to receipt ratio is relatively low. So that's something positive. So that with these low interest rates could help the federal government to issue debt and finance part of the increase in government spending if the administration implements a more aggressive countercyclical fiscal policy. And the last thing I'm going to say is that there was a small real increase in wages for full-time employees, about 7%, which was also positive. I'm not going to talk more about that, but perhaps because Glenn is going to talk about that later.
So yeah, Daniel, Glenn, is there anything you want to add to that? That's a lot of great information. I'm glad you ended on that higher note too. There's a little bit of bright light there, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I was just curious, Roberto, do you know if the fall in government expenditure is because of a particularly large decrease in local and state expenditures due to sales tax revenue falling, something like that?
It's not clear because it's the whole aggregate. So we're talking about the sum of government expenditures and public investment.
Okay.
So one possibility could be that some kind of public investment, some kind of public projects are not being developed due to the pandemic and the shutdown or the lockdown and the inability of some workers to move. So probably there's a slowdown of that. Perhaps that's part of the story behind those numbers. But that's true. We have to look within those areas and check more carefully what is going on, which components in that aggregate and within those what is going on.
Yeah, and I think too, adding with so thinking about those unemployment numbers, I think that they were bad. They were really bad around May or April was horrible. I mean, we lost 20 million jobs just in the month of April, and so during the first years of the Trump administration from 2017 to 2019, there was a creation of 6.6 million jobs, and you're like, wow, that's pretty good, But it took 3 years to create 6.6 million jobs, and then in 1 month in April we lost 20 million. I mean, that's putting that in perspective, that's a lot of jobs. And so I think that, right, a lot of the expectation was that, boy, this is going to be bad for a really, really long time. And it turned out, maybe because of all of the PPP protection programs that they put in place to hopefully have employers keep their current set of employees somehow, right? So maybe it was because of that, or maybe it was because we were too grim in our sort of overall estimates. But the unemployment rate dropped. We're still 10 million in the hole, right? There's still a huge deficit here for us to make up. But right now we're still, 7.6% unemployment rate is not great, but it's not near as bad as the 15 or, sometimes even higher. And so the core unemployment rate is not great, but it's not as bad as maybe we have thought. And there is some fear that, without any other kinds of interventions, that I think, as Roberto was saying, that we're gonna hit this really high unemployment rates again. But another thing I think that Roberto was kind of talking about too is how can we think about, well, what happens with wages in this case, and how can we think about wages? Well, of course, one of those things, whenever we start going from unemployed to reemployed again, one thing that happens is, well, where are these individuals reemployed at? So are they going to be reemployed at the same level of job that they had before, or are they going to be sort of what we're going to call underemployed in a sense? And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they keep track of all of this stuff, right? They keep track of the core unemployment rate, which is, how many people have a job that want a job and how many people don't have a job that want a job. But they keep track of these other things that are essentially kind of like, well, including those people who are unemployed and also those people who are a little bit underemployed, right? Relative to their skill set, are they actually in the job that sort of maximizes their skill set in this sense? So are they in a job that is only part-time, for instance? Are they in some way some of these other kinds of things? And so from that metric, we're still at about 12 to 13% of the population is unemployed and underemployed. And so pre-pandemic levels, it was about 6%. And so we're still more than double of that sort of underemployment rate, according to the BLS estimates from September. So even though we're sort of improving on our sort of unemployment rate, in order for us to really sort of recognize, sort of these pre-pandemic levels, we've got to sort of get these people back into full employment type pictures. And I think, also what Roberto was saying, there is this fear now that we have this permanent job loss. That these jobs, some of these jobs that went away, at first it was well, they're going to go away and hopefully they come back. But more and more we're realizing that these are sort of more permanent. And specifically what Roberto was saying is, how do we deal with these people? We're losing human capital, we're losing knowledge of the industry that those individuals were at. But in addition to that, what are we going to do? These people, they don't have a job, their skill sets are no longer needed in that industry. So what do you do with them? Right, there has to be. Are they going to retrain themselves? Are they going to get? Are they magically going to get a new set of skills? And so, I think that there's a lot of the policies sort of from the different candidates. They're trying to figure out, how do we get to, So, whenever I'm talking about this to my class, I say, okay, at some point we had a bunch of people that were making wagon wheels, but eventually we didn't need wagon wheels makers anymore, right? So we would say, in the long run, we're going to transition out of wagon wheel makers, and we don't need them anymore. But what do we do in the meantime? What do we do in this sort of short-term period or the intermediate term period to sort of, are we going to retrain them? Are they just going to, sort of go to the old-fashioned, the old poor house, right? They just go into a poor house and then, yeah. So a bunch of fun. These are fun. Like as you can tell, we really like the numbers, right? We really like talking about all these numbers.
Well, another thing that makes the pandemic kind of different than other recessions or Great Depression even is the potential mobility limitation due to the pandemic, right? So normally when you lose a job, one thing you can do is you can move to a new city to either get a better match or where there's a better labor market. But in this particular instance, it's harder to find those matches because mobility is limited. And also there's less churn in particularly low levels of economic activity. There's less churn, so there's less openings to find kind of a slot to move into. And so in kind of Keynesian theory, you can kind of get stuck at a lower level where you're not quite creating a churn to create the openings, to find new jobs, to create the connections and productivity. So I don't know if Roberto subscribes to any of those kinds of more Keynesian ideas, but that's one thought.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, those are all great points, and I've never thought of that in that way, that, you know, the mobility during this pandemic has definitely made it a lot harder on people if they do want to move or go find something else. And Glenn, I loved the analogy you used with the wheel. You know, it makes a lot of sense in that regard when you put it that way too. We actually have our first question from our Facebook user as well. So this is for all of you to answer. Greg on Facebook asked, as we move forward toward a world of globalization, do you favor the Western economic system? So whoever wants to start with that one. Daniel, yep.
So I would say Western economic system, we're thinking maybe Western Europe, United States, Canada. I'm going to interpret Greg's question in that kind of structure. Mm-hmm. I would say what we exist in a market economy where the fundamental allocation of resources is done through a price mechanism. There, on the margin, there are other allocation mechanisms, for example, the government, and the size of that depends on various states, but they're still governed by prices. They have to buy resources from the private sector, and they have to potentially sell goods and services outside of the government sector. So there's a price mechanism that causes this allocation. I think economic history has been pretty strong and pretty clear that a price mechanism to allocate goods and services is the current best mechanism, and there's no mechanism that has come close to its efficiency in terms of allocation of resources and wealth accumulation. So going back to early, long time ago, Middle Ages, very low economic activity, low wealth, low health standards, and then hit the Industrial Revolution, very market-oriented policies in Western Europe and America. We see this kind of take off in the growth curve. And I think it's pretty clear that this market-based system, I think, is here to stay, and we see that it's expanding. Can it be improved on? Can there be tweaks? Does it have a perfect outcome in all cases? No. Economists have a term for this called market failures. My area of expertise, pollution, right, and environment. Pollution is a market failure, and every serious economist will tell you that needs to be taken seriously. I was just watching a video from Milton Friedman, 1971, on the Phil Donahue show, talking about pollution taxes and saying every serious economist needs to know that externalities are real and we need to take them seriously. And we have a price mechanism that fits right into the market that can deal with that. We call that a carbon tax, right? And so we have ways to integrate these things all together.
Yeah, and kind of building on that a little bit, Dan. I mean, there. So I was thinking about I think it was Larry Samuelson maybe on the Charlie Rose show. So we like I guess we all key in on whenever economists are on any kind of show. We're like, wow, they made it big time, because we're usually very antisocial kind of people. So I was thinking, right. So something you said was that, I mean, so let's think about just a very small increase or decrease in percentage-wise in GDP growth. So GDP growth, we think, is, as Roberto has already said, is sort of how we think about how an economy advances. And so let's say that a market-based system gives you just a 0.2% growth rate over another kind of system, whatever that system was. And so Larry Samuelson was saying, yeah, on a one-year basis, that 0.2% is basically, you can't really tell that much, right? It doesn't really change on a one-year basis whether one country is doing better than another country. But if you look at that 0.2 growth rate over 20, 30, 40 years, then sort of those effects are really going to start adding up. And so we see, for instance, initially these kinds of market-based versus non-market-based economies, initially they might look very, very similar. And you might expect, well, I don't know that we can trust any of the numbers coming out of some of the old school Cold War era economies, but initially it looks like they're doing okay. But over time, right, over 50, 60 years, the market-based economy, even if it's just a 0.2% increase in that growth rate, it seems to just outperform the other ones, and over time the other ones essentially collapse, right?
Yeah, Roberto, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think behind the growth, the sustained growth that Dan was commenting, yes. So there's a market economy with different degrees of state intervention, government intervention, and the engine of growth is, according to theory and according to many macroeconomists that study growth economics, is total factor productivity. So at the end, is technology is the main driver of sustained growth. Technology and advances in technology understood in a wide sense, right? And all the institutions, all the government institutions that allow that process of innovation, right, of creation, and behind that, education, the combination. We were talking about human capital as well. Those are all factors that contribute to economic growth and to the development of nations. And as I was saying, we observed this sustained growth after the Industrial Revolution, and especially in economies like the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. So that group of economies has grown in a sustained way. Japan as well in that group. And unfortunately, the rest of the world, many developing economies especially, are in another club, in which we observe slow growth, in which we observe large swings in GDP, so large macroeconomic fluctuations, and sometimes even no growth at all. Sometimes there are cases in which the growth rates are very close to 0%.
I would like to follow up in another interpretation of Greg's question about globalization. I'm going to infer maybe also a kind of thought about trade and how there's trade across countries and concerns about that. So maybe a globalization and a trade Western measure is maybe also what Greg was going for. So let me interpret that dynamic as well, since I interpreted another dynamic to begin with. So, and when I was certainly beginning my training as a young economist in college, there was very much a 100% free trade. Let's grow the pie. So we're going to specialize and we're going to grow the pie. We're going to make the pie as big as possible, and that will make everybody wealthier. And I think economics has definitely, the trade and growth has shown that indeed trade makes the pie bigger. I think what I personally didn't appreciate as much is how fast the division of the pie would change over the past 20 years. And so I think it is true that freer trade policy has grown the pie. So we can think about hundreds of millions of, particularly, for example, in China, who are no longer in absolute poverty levels. So that pie, that wealth pie, has gotten a lot bigger. But the speed at which the pie gets divided up has, in my estimation, been accelerating, and that has caused some maybe issues, right? We'll call it issues in different, depends on what sector, what part of the world, what town, what city, what state, etc. And so I think that part was a little bit underappreciated, which I think we're getting more evidence about. There's certainly lots of good papers about, textiles in the southeast part of the United States from David Otter. He has a great paper on this in Shocks with Trade in China. Particular favorite of mine. He shows this very clearly. And so I think this division of the pie issue is maybe another vein in which Greg might be thinking.
So inequality, in a sense, right, Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that inequality is maybe one of the issues, right? Yep. So displacement is another, right? So if the factory in my town closes, maybe I have to move, right? Inequality, in my sense is, maybe Roberto has another sense, the inequality within a particular area may be increasing, but the also average inequality across places may be decreasing in some instances. Yep. And so it depends on which cross section and which data point you're looking at. Could be, if the pie is getting bigger, on average, everybody's wealthier, right? So
interesting. All points I've never one even heard of, let alone had it explained to me. So I'm hoping, Greg, one that answered your question phenomenally. Also, I hope everyone else took a little bit of that in, since I personally feel like it's something, not maybe talked about as much, especially in regards to this idea of globalization. But I do want to go back to something, Daniel, that you had mentioned earlier about this carbon tax and climate. So, climate has been another major topic within this election. So can you talk about, what are the chances for climate policy to be enacted if Biden or Trump wins, and what form that policy will take?
Yeah, so I'd first like to note that in surveys of voters and asking their preferences or importance of issues, climate policy has been steadily moving up the list over the past decade or so. And right now in this election, it's between 4 and 5. So we have like economy, coronavirus, maybe one or two other things, and then climate policy is kind of right there. So I'd say it's relatively high on that scale compared to what it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. So that's the first note. There seems to be a majority of Americans want some kind of policy to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So there's the big debate about what that policy is going to look like and who are the winners and losers. And we as economists can have a lot to inform about that, right? So if you do this policy, then here are the costs and benefits, and here are the groups that win and lose, right? So as Glenn was explaining at the beginning. So I think those are the first pieces to start with. Then we'll go with the election. So I'm thinking about basically 3 different scenarios. So we'll stipulate that the House of Representatives will remain in Democratic control. So then there's 3 basic outcomes, right? There is Biden wins with the Democratic Senate with a majority between over 50, but less than 60. Then we have Biden wins with the Republican Senate, and we have Trump wins. And if Trump wins, then there will be a Republican Senate, right? So those are the 3 election outcomes. So what is the chances they're enacted? If the first scenario happens, Vice President Biden becomes the president, and there's a Democratic Senate with between 50 and 60, so not at the 60 threshold for filibuster, but above 50. My guess would be there would be what's known as a budget reconciliation bill that would be brought to enact kind of a tax-like mechanism. So here's the reason why. So budget reconciliation is a basically metric where you have existing budget structure, and you can fiddle around with the numbers in the existing budget structure. So this is the structure that, for example, the Trump administration used to do their tax bill in 2017. So basically, you can just fiddle with the numbers in the existing structure. So it's not like, for example, the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, they need to get to the 60 vote threshold because they're creating whole new programs, basically a new structure that requires the 60 vote threshold. You can have the 50 vote threshold and play with numbers in that threshold. So most likely it would be a reconciliation policy. Because it's on budget and needs to be budget neutral, then what you have is revenue raised from a carbon tax and then revenue going on the budget that can be played around with in the existing budget structure. So if the first scenario happens, I would say there's a pretty good chance that there will be a budget reconciliation bill with some kind of carbon fee that escalates over time. That would be my guess in that. And right now, according to 538 probabilities, you multiply those 2 probabilities together, that's about a 60% chance. So about 90%, a little less than 90% Biden, a little bit less than 75% Senate. Multiply those 2 things together, you get a little bit more than 60% probability. Okay, if Biden wins in the Republican Senate and Mitch McConnell is also reelected, which is probably going to happen, I don't see a good path there. It just doesn't seem like climate policy is on Leader McConnell's agenda. And then if President Trump is reelected, I would say a similar possibility. So that'd be my first cut at that answer.
Great, thank you. I know that is probably something on a lot of people's minds, just like you said, with the, climate policy being, I feel like, an issue that's growing and growing over time and becoming, a bigger topic of discussion. So I'm glad that we have a little more clarification on what could happen with that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I step in just a minute? Yeah, Dan, how does that work? So if we're enacting these kinds of climate taxes, how does that work? Like, who is taxed? Where is the price is going to go up somewhere? What happens there?
Okay, so as I mentioned, because it's budget reconciliation, it would probably have to be a price mechanism to be in the budget structure. So you have some flexibility with who pays the tax. So we call that the statutory incidence, basically who hands the money over to the government, right? In economics, there's this very subtle and big issue that whoever pays the money doesn't necessarily bear the economic burden of the tax for complicated reasons, and we can go into that in a minute. But basically, to think about it is, if you really want something and someone else has to pay a tax for that transaction, they can leverage the tax onto you, okay? So because you're relatively inflexible, so they can kind of push the tax burden onto you if you really want to buy something. Okay, so that's the first thing. The easiest way to implement a carbon tax is to basically go up to the very place in which carbon enters the economy. So go to the fossil fuels at the beginning and tax those. So you can implement the tax anywhere you want. That's also, at a first approximation, true, right? So you can tax it at the very end, you can tax it at the very beginning. All you care about is that the carbon is taxed once. So go to the fuels. You can tax the coal at the train station when it's put on the train. You can tax the oil when it comes out of the refinery, or you can tax the natural gas when it's put on the pipeline. First cut, that's pretty easy to do. That'd be an equivalent outcome that if you taxed emissions that came out of every smokestack. So you can do it either way, but having fewer tax points is relatively simple. And so you only have a limited number of entities to collect the tax from. And the carbon content of that tax is very well known. Why? Because the carbon content is perfectly correlated with the energy available in the fossil fuel. And the energy is what people care about. So the amount of carbon is precisely known. And so that is why it's pretty easy to figure out where the carbon emissions are coming from. So does that help clarify, Glenn?
Yeah, so then I'm thinking, so they're going to collect all this revenue. What are they going to do with it? Just pump it back into the roads or what? Infrastructure investment?
Yeah, so the question is, how much revenue is it? And at about a $40 carbon tax, it's going to raise about $2 trillion over 10 years. So it's a lot of money because there's a lot of carbon, okay? And that's not even a very high tax. It's not even a very high tax. It's a pretty moderate tax. That would be like 10 cents a gallon gasoline, right? Something like that. And so it's a lot of revenue. This is one of the things that you can do is you can say, well, let's tax the bads and not the goods. So you can do things like cut payroll taxes, right, to encourage labor. You can cut taxes to investment if you need to stimulate investment. So you can now have hundreds of billions of dollars a year coming in on the revenue side of the ledger to fix a problem most people in America want to fix anyway. And you can use that revenue to cut taxes elsewhere. Or you can just cut people checks. You can just hand the money back to the people. Right? That's called a lump sum transfer. That allows people to optimally decide what they care about to use the money for. And importantly, people at the low, if you just divide the money evenly, people at the lowest 70% of the income distribution would have more real income under the rebate policy than they have 70% more real income under the rebate policy. Why? Because really rich people use a lot of carbon. When you take an airplane trip, you use a lot of carbon emissions. People with a lot of money take a lot of plane trips, right? And so basically at the low income, energy is a high fraction of your expenditure, but your carbon footprint is relatively small. We're at the high end of the income distribution. The carbon footprint is large, even though the expenditure is a small fraction of your income. So it's basically going to, if you do a lump sum transfer, the lowest income groups will actually be better off in real terms. And they can decide not to use energy. They don't have to, but they can use the same amount and be able to pay for it. So lots of choices. Lump sum rebate would be my preference. I'm pretty sure it's Roberto's preference. Yeah.
It is.
Yes.
All right.
Say from what you said, that sounds like a good idea to me, but I'm not the economist here.
That's what we're here for.
Right? So yeah, I'm already learning. Hopefully everyone else is too about this. So another question, and this is for all of you, going back to the candidates' views. In your view, in your own opinion, which candidate's economic plan do you think would be more effective in reactivating, the economy as it currently is, both in regards to going forward as COVID is still, very present and it doesn't necessarily look like it's going away anytime soon. And thinking that this probably may go forward for years as the new elect is in office. So if you each want to talk a little bit about the candidates' plans and if there's one in particular that looks like it's going to revitalize the country more.
Yeah, let me start saying a few things. A couple of things. One is I've been looking at the proposals regarding the pandemic control and fiscal policies. Regarding the pandemic control, I've tried to look for information about Trump's proposal. I have not found much information about that. I have checked several sources, his own campaign website, and there's not much information about that. There's one that is more related to or overlaps with fiscal policy that I can discuss later, but in terms of Biden's proposal, there is much more detail and a disaggregated plan. There's a long list. I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 of them. For example, invest $25 billion in a vaccine manufacturing and distribution plan, implement a national contact tracing program, assist schools and childcare programs with reopening, require health insurance plans to completely cover COVID-19 testing and vaccines. I think, aside from numbers, I think, and I'm not, of course, a health economist, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think they look to me that they are in the right direction. Now, thinking about fiscal policies, this is hard to tell, frankly, because I don't have enough information. I've been looking for information about Trump's policies, and the only thing that I found is 2 pieces of information about government expenditures and investment. $2 trillion, very big and bold plan as part of the next congressional coronavirus relief package, which includes the stimulus payments, and $1 trillion to rebuild U.S. infrastructure. That's all what I got. Biden has, again, a more detailed and disaggregated plan. For example, government stimulus, a relief plan larger than $2 trillion, $300 billion in research and development, $100 billion to modernize schools, $50 billion repairing roads, bridges, and highways, $400 billion to buy American products and services, and so on and so forth. And the list continues. So if we look at these numbers, still is hard to tell. It still is really hard to tell which could be more effective because, as I was saying before, there's not much information about Trump's policies. Now, if we look at these 2 pieces of information, for example, this $2 trillion in terms of this coronavirus relief package, and probably $1 trillion of that is to rebuild U.S. infrastructure, it seems that it's much more focused on infrastructure. It seems that 50% of that would be focused on infrastructure, which is positive. On the other side, Biden is also planning to spend a good amount of this $2 trillion in modernizing schools, repairing roads. As I said, again, that's also part of infrastructure. So in that sense, I would say that is I would say an adequate way to reactivate the economy. So whenever we talk about public investment, the reason is that there is a high multiplier effect associated with public investment. For example, Biden was talking about modernization of the school. That I think also could have a high multiplier effect. And when I say multiplier effect, I mean the effect on GDP. So for every dollar spent in government expenditures, how much is GDP affected? So if, for example, the multiplier is 0.8, for every dollar spent, then GDP is going to increase in 80 cents. So I'm talking about that multiplier effect. So we have found in macroeconomic research, that certain kind of expenditure have large multiplier effects. So I'm talking about, again, public infrastructure, education, research and development. So in that sense, I like those this proposal that Biden is mentioning about investment in research and development. Again, modernization of schools and public infrastructure in general. So, so that about the spending plans. Trans spending plan creates uncertainty. That's my last comment, because we don't have, again, this disaggregation, this detail, and enough information to have a better idea of how can his plan be more effective, or effective as we wish. It seems that Biden's plan seems to be more effective because of the potentially higher multipliers, at least in the items I mentioned.
Yeah, and so I think that's, so building a little bit on what Roberto was talking about. I mean, if you look at a lot of the estimates that a lot of different organizations are put together in terms of job growth, it looks like there's a lot of the estimates are that Biden's plan will generate more job growth going forward over a sort of an 8-year time span. And I think, and also building off of what Roberto was saying is that, yeah, I mean, it is a little bit more difficult to find specific policies for Trump. And so what we have to do is go back and look at, well, what has he done in the past? Mm-hmm. And so probably what he's done in the past is likely going to be his policy stance in some way. And so, but they do both agree that infrastructure spending is something that both candidates are wanting to push through. And I would say that that's probably going to happen no matter who gets elected. It's sort of this nice bipartisan issue where they sort of both agree. Mm-hmm. I think where they disagree on that is exactly where Roberto was talking about, is sort of in the Biden plan. I mean, what he's and this is going to go into Dan's stuff too, is that really what Biden is proposing is that as part of that infrastructure spending in the R&D, he really wants to emphasize training for clean energy. And so part of his plan is, so we said, what are we going to do with the wagon wheel workers who are displaced? Well, part of his plan is to introduce these kind of education programs, specifically at 2-year community college or these kinds of technical schools that'll train them to do these kinds of clean energy jobs. So transition the workforce that maybe has been laid off or permanently unemployed in a sense, to sort of in transition them to sort of a clean energy, which will be part of his infrastructure plan, which I think this is what's being picked up in a lot of those estimates, saying that the Biden plan relative to the Trump plan is expected to generate more job growth.
Yeah, so to pick up on Glenn's piece there in terms of clean energy jobs, this is one thing I actually want to highlight, is that clean energy jobs, even though there's lots of capital, we call capital machines in wind and solar, relative to fossil fuels, it's actually relatively labor intensive. So I like to think of clean energy jobs as being like an energy manufacturing process, where you have this kind of continual flow of a natural resource, wind or solar, and you're kind of manufacturing the energy, as opposed to an energy extraction model of the fossil fuels. So one thing to think about is you need to have a lot of workers to go to all the windmills and maintain them. You got to climb up on those big windmills, and you got to get inside the machine. They're actually, the turbines are big enough you can walk into them. There's a giant generator in there. People climb up there and they go inside and they do maintenance. And they have to take off the blades and they have to replace the blades. And we're building hundreds of these every year, right? Thousands of these every year. And so there needs to be workers that are able not just to build them, but to maintain them, and to, on the solar panels, to install them and clean them and get everything working and make sure that's all maintained. And so that's going to be a continual process rather than just kind of do it once and then it's done. So that's one way to think about the energy sector.
Great.
Yeah, and I would say too. So
yeah,
sorry. Sorry. I was going to say too. I mean, there's sort of a different approach too with the two candidates, in that, I mean, you would say that Biden is probably a lot more pro-union, right? And so he's really kind of trying to consistently make these arguments, and that's a very traditional democratic argument that we need strong unions and union membership and all of these things. And so he's very pro-union, right? And the philosophy there is sort of a bottom-up approach that if we're pro-union, this pro-union will generate other kinds of benefits for society and maybe also a stable workforce and economic growth in these things. And sort of Trump's policy based on, again, it's hard, you can't find this on his website, but based on his sort of the policies he's implemented in the past is very anti-union, right? And that's not necessarily, I don't want to say pro and anti as they're loaded terms, but anti-union in the sense that it's sort of a top-down approach that if we sort of incentivize the corporations to do as they wish, then they're going to be more nimble. They're going to be able to go towards the opportunities, hire and fire people easier, promote people easier, and all those other kinds of things. And so, I think too that the two candidates, it seems as if they really disagree on sort of do we want the top-down approach of sort of the anti-union, or do we want sort of the bottom-up approach, which is sort of the pro-union? And they do seem to disagree quite a bit on which policy they think is better.
Yeah, one more thing about fiscal policy. There's another important dimension quickly, which is the tax policy. Trump, basically, to be brief, is proposing to keep taxes or reduce taxes, while Biden is proposing to increase taxes to corporation individuals that make more than $400,000 per year. So that's another important difference in terms of tax policy, fiscal policy. Probably the Biden's proposal is going to, at least in that sense, affect less the fiscal deficit because it's going to collect more taxes. On the other hand, given that the taxes are going to pay by very high income individuals and corporations, probably that's going to also perhaps some positive effects on income distribution, the income inequality that we were talking about before.
Great, yeah, all great points. I'm glad you brought up that thought about the tax on the $400,000, because I know that's been something going around that people don't quite understand and have questions about as well. All great points made, and I'm very glad that we had this conversation. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of it, but I did want to open the floor if there's any last thoughts or statements that you'd each like to say.
I'm good. I've had fun. It's been a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk too. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I feel like I'm so much more informed right now on the economic side of it than I ever was before. You all are great teachers, and your students are very lucky to have you to talk about this with, and hopefully our viewers also took that away. It is so appreciative that you took the time to talk about this tonight, and so I just, out of the kindness of my heart, really thank you for sitting down. And so for all of our viewers, again, if you have any questions for these experts, please feel free to message our social media accounts, as well as comment on the live stream and on the video, and we will be sure to send those questions to these experts to answer. Again, thank you so much, and my parting words, as always, is tomorrow is it. It is election day. If you have not gotten out and voted, who cares if it's a 3-hour line? Go ahead and do it. Stand in the line, vote, because tomorrow is it. But again, thank you all so much, and have a good evening.